The air hung thick with salt and anticipation as Lieutenant Thomas Blackwell crouched low behind the bluff, his fingers gripping not a rifle but a wooden control box. Around him, a dozen men held their breath, faces smeared with camouflage paint that gleamed dully in the moonlight. Below, the English Channel stretched dark and vast, its surface rippling with tiny waves that caught fragments of starlight. "Steady now," he whispered, watching the second hand on his wristwatch tick relentlessly forward. 3, 2, 1. With a sharp click, he pressed the switch. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, as if by some ancient magic, the empty coastline before them erupted into life. Hundreds of lights blinked on simultaneously, transforming the barren cliffs into what appeared to be a bustling airfield. Landing strips illuminated, signal lamps flashed, and the silhouettes of aircraft, mere canvas and wood, suddenly became visible against the night sky. 5 miles out to sea, Thomas knew German reconnaissance planes would be watching, their observers frantically scribbling notes as they witnessed what seemed to be a massive Allied air operation unfolding. But it was all smoke and mirrors, an elaborate theatrical production staged by what would later be called the Ghost Army, a tactical deception unit whose mission was not to fight battles, but to create the illusion of them. What would those German pilots make of this phantom airbase that had materialized from nowhere? How many divisions would Hitler redirect based on this single night's performance? As Thomas surveyed the false runway lights stretching before him, a question formed in his mind that would echo throughout the war. In a conflict where perception shaped reality, could an army that didn't exist actually change the course of history? The Ghost Army wasn't born of traditional military thinking. It emerged from the minds of artists, actors, and engineers recruited from America's leading art schools and advertising agencies. Men who, in peacetime, would have been designing window displays at Macy's or painting portraits in Greenwich Village studios found themselves instead crafting the greatest deception campaign of World War II. Captain Harold Reeves, formerly a set designer for Broadway productions, recalled his recruitment with a mixture of disbelief and pride. "I was painting backdrops for Oklahoma when the military approached me," he told his journal. "They asked if I could create convincing battle scenery that would fool observers from 5,000 feet up. I laughed and told them Broadway had prepared me to fool audiences from just 20 feet away." The unit, officially designated as the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, combined 4 specialized elements: visual deception, sonic deception, radio deception, and atmospheric manipulation. Together, they formed a shadow theater company whose stage was the European battlefield and whose audience was the German High Command. Their equipment wasn't what you'd expect from a combat unit. Instead of tanks, they had inflatable rubber replicas that could be assembled in hours. Instead of artillery batteries, they deployed powerful speakers that could broadcast the sounds of an entire armored division moving into position. Rather than genuine radio traffic, they transmitted meticulously crafted false messages designed to be intercepted by enemy intelligence. When the first shipments of these peculiar weapons arrived in England, many traditional military officers scoffed. Colonel Walter Richards of the 7th Armored Division famously remarked, "They've sent us a circus instead of reinforcements." He couldn't have known then how crucial this circus would prove to the Allied victory. The early training of the Ghost Army defied conventional military logic. While other soldiers practiced marksmanship and hand-to-hand combat, these men studied acoustics, lighting techniques, and the principles of visual perspective. They learned to mimic the radio operators of different units, each with distinctive transmission patterns that German signal intelligence had catalogued. They practiced inflating and positioning dummy tanks in ways that would cast convincing shadows when photographed from above. Perhaps strangest of all, they developed what they called special effects, techniques to create the atmospheric signatures of large military units. Sergeant Martin Klein, a former chemistry student from Boston University, developed a mixture that, when burned, produced the same smoke pattern as 50 tanks idling their engines. "The Germans aren't just looking for what they can see," he explained to new recruits. "They're analyzing dust patterns, exhaust signatures, even the disturbance patterns in morning dew." We have to fool all their senses, not just their eyes. By early 1944, As the Allies prepared for the invasion of Normandy, the Ghost Army was ready for its greatest performance. But even its own members couldn't have anticipated how thoroughly their theatrical methods would reshape modern warfare, or how their phantom forces would dance across Europe, leading the Reich's generals in a deadly game of shadow and substance that would stretch from the beaches of France to the forests of the Ardennes. The night before Operation Fortitude, the massive deception plan designed to convince German forces that the Allied invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy, Lieutenant Blackwell found himself standing in the strangest military formation he'd ever witnessed. Around him, hundreds of men worked with the focused intensity of stagehands before opening night, inflating rubber Sherman tanks that weighed just 90 pounds yet looked identical to the 26-ton originals from a distance. "Remember," Captain Reeves called out, pacing between the growing rows of decoys, "these need to fool reconnaissance photographs. Check your shadows, check your placement patterns. Real tank commanders don't park in neat rows. They seek cover, they follow terrain contours. Make it messy, make it real." The sheer scale of the illusion was breathtaking. Where there had been empty fields that morning, by nightfall there appeared to be the encampment of an entire armored division, roughly 20,000 troops and hundreds of vehicles. In reality, fewer than 1,000 men of the Ghost Army had created the entire tableau. What would happen when this phantom army suddenly moved toward a different section of coastline?
How würde deutsche Intelligenz interpretieren die Signale, die sie wären aufzunehmen? Die Antwort würde bestimmen nicht nur den Erfolg von D-Day, but potentially den entganzen Kurs des Krieges in Western-Europa. Der Morgen nach der Decoy Airbase-Operation, Thomas saß in einem camouflierten Observationspost, lüsternd zu interceptetem German Radio-Traffic. Die Nachtsperformance hat erzielt ihren Zweck. Enemy Reconnaissance reported heavy air activity along the fourth section of coastline und German Command war bereits redirecting anti-aircraft batteries away from the actual invasion sites. "It's working", wisperte Captain James Whitney, der Unit's Intelligence Officer, als händete Thomas einen dekodierten Transkript. "They're moving their 88th Division to counter our Phantom airdrops." Thomas nodded, fühlen den strangen Mischung von Elation und Unrealität, das charakteristisch Ghost Army-Operationen charakterisierte. Sie hatten gerade eine deutsche Division defeated, ohne einen Schuss zu feuern, ohne riskieren einen Life.
The division they diverted would now be absent from the real battlefield, where American soldiers would face fewer enemies because of this elaborate charade. The Ghost Army's operations expanded dramatically after D-Day. As Allied forces pushed inland, the deception unit repeatedly created the impression of strength where there was weakness and weakness where there was strength. They became masters of what military theorists would later call tactical misdirection, the art of making the enemy look where you are not while hiding where you actually are. Their techniques grew increasingly sophisticated. Sound engineers like Corporal David Silverman, formerly a radio producer from Chicago, recorded actual armored movements, then edited and enhanced the recordings to create what they called sonic battlefield landscapes. Massive speakers mounted on half-tracks could project these sounds up to 15 miles across open country.
"The human ear is remarkably easy to fool," Silverman noted in his field journal. "We discovered that playing the sounds of tanks at 70% volume actually seemed more convincing than full volume. The brain fills in what it expects to hear." Perhaps most remarkable was the unit's use of atmosphere actors, men who would enter villages in advance of their sonic and visual deceptions, playing the roles of reconnaissance officers or advanced scouts. They would openly discuss troop movements in village cafes where known German sympathizers might overhear, or leave classified documents in wastebaskets for enemy agents to discover. Sergeant William Thayer, who had studied at Yale Drama School before the war, recalled one such operation near St. Lo. "I spent 3 hours in a French bistro pretending to be an artillery officer with the 4th Division. I complained loudly about our orders to move 30,000 men through the village the next day." In reality, the 4th was 50 miles away, but by morning, German armor was repositioning to meet this phantom threat. These theatrical performances carried real danger. Unlike actual combat units, the Ghost Army typically operated with minimal defensive capabilities. If their deceptions were discovered while in progress, they would be extremely vulnerable to attack. They traveled light, moved frequently, and relied on stealth and timing rather than firepower. The men developed a gallows humor about their peculiar situation. "We're the only unit in the army that can be completely destroyed by a single machine gun nest," Captain Whitney remarked, after a particularly close call near Brest, where German patrols nearly stumbled upon a nighttime inflation operation. Despite these risks, by August 1944, the Ghost Army had conducted over 20 major deception operations, each one saving countless Allied lives by diverting German forces from actual combat zones.
Yet even as they refined their techniques and expanded their repertoire of illusions, they were preparing for their most audacious performance, a phantom river crossing that would require every trick in their increasingly sophisticated arsenal. The Ghost Army's masterpiece of deception unfolded along the Rhine River in March 1945. As General Patton's Third Army prepared for an actual crossing, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was tasked with creating the impression of a massive buildup 20 miles north of the genuine crossing point. The operation involved every element of their deceptive capabilities working in perfect synchronization. Radio operators broadcast thousands of fake messages suggesting preparations for a major assault. Sonic teams positioned their speakers to simulate the sounds of hundreds of vehicles moving into position. Visual deception units deployed over 300 inflatable tanks and dozens of fake artillery pieces, all carefully positioned to be visible to German observers on the opposite bank. Most daringly, atmosphere actors moved through villages in broad daylight, wearing the patches of divisions that were actually positioned far away. They frequented local establishments, dropped hints to civilians, and generally created the impression of an enormous military presence. Sergeant Ellis Robinson, an artist from Philadelphia who specialized in creating fake tire tracks and vehicle paths, described the elaborate choreography in a letter home, later heavily censored. "Imagine painting a picture where the canvas is 2 miles wide, your brushes are trucks and bulldozers, and your audience is trying to kill you if they spot you working. That's what we do every day now." The technical challenges were enormous. Rubber tanks had to be repositioned regularly to simulate movement and avoid detection as decoys. This often meant deflating them before dawn, moving them to new positions, and re-inflating them, all without being observed by enemy reconnaissance. Sound engineers faced the additional challenge of the river itself, which carried acoustic properties that could reveal their deception. They conducted extensive tests, placing microphones at various distances across water to understand how genuine tank and troop movements should sound when heard from the German side. "Water carries sound differently," explained Corporal Silverman. "A recording that perfectly simulates an armored division over land sounds artificial over water." We had to re-record everything with the microphones partially submerged to capture the right acoustic signature. The radio deception team, meanwhile, created an entire fictional command structure, complete with fictional officers who had consistent personalities and communication patterns. They maintained logs of which fictional unit had communicated with which other unit, ensuring that their electronic theater maintained perfect internal consistency. Captain Whitney, monitoring German communications, soon reported success beyond their hopes. "They've moved 3 panzer battalions and an artillery regiment to counter our crossing. The actual crossing, 20 miles south, will now face significantly reduced opposition." For the men of the Ghost Army, this success brought a unique combination of pride and invisibility. Their greatest achievements could never be publicly acknowledged during the war. Even fellow American units often had no idea they were operating nearby. They watched as combat divisions received commendations for victories that their deceptions had helped secure, while their own role remained classified. "We're fighting a shadow war against an enemy who doesn't know we exist," Lieutenant Blackwell wrote in his journal. "Our battlefield is the German mind. Our weapons are light and sound and radio waves. How do you measure victory in such a conflict? Not in territory gained or enemies killed, but in what doesn't happen, in the battles that never occur because the enemy is looking the wrong way. This philosophical question haunted many of the unit's members. In a war where heroism was typically measured in direct combat, they were engaged in something more subtle, more psychological. Were their theatrical talents really making a difference comparable to the sacrifice of infantrymen at the front? The answer came in the form of intelligence reports documenting German troop movements. For every successful deception, enemy forces were drawn away from real Allied operations, reducing casualties and accelerating advancement. By early 1945, military analysts estimated that the Ghost Army had successfully diverted up to 40,000 German troops from actual combat zones at critical moments. As Allied forces pressed deeper into Germany, the Ghost Army's operations became increasingly complex. They were no longer merely creating the illusion of military units where none existed. They were now crafting entire fictional battle plans designed to confuse German intelligence about actual Allied intentions. One particularly effective technique developed during this period was the phantom withdrawal, in which the Ghost Army would create the impression that Allied forces were retreating from an area, while actual combat units maintained their positions or even advanced. Counterattacks would then be launched against non-existent opportunities, exposing their forces to devastating flanking maneuvers. Major Robert Stevens, who joined the unit in late 1944 after serving as a theater director in civilian life, described the evolution of their approach. "We began as stage designers, creating static displays. We became playwrights, crafting dynamic narratives that unfolded over days or weeks. The Germans weren't just seeing our sets, they were following our storylines, making decisions based on the dramatic tension we created." This shift from static deception to narrative deception represented a fundamental innovation in military thinking. Rather than simply showing the enemy something false, the Ghost Army was telling them a convincing story that would lead them to make predictable decisions. It was psychological warfare elevated to an art form. The human element of these deceptions could sometimes lead to unexpected emotional complexities. Captain Harold Reeves recalled an incident near the German border that highlighted the strange moral territory they inhabited. "We had created a fictional artillery position near a small village. The German response was to shell the empty field where our inflatable howitzers stood. No real damage done to our side. But then I visited the village and found the residents terrified, believing they were now in a combat zone. An old woman clutched my arm and begged me to tell her if her home would be destroyed. What could I say? That the shells falling nearby were a response to our lies? That her fear was based on our fiction? This is the strange burden we carry. We create false dangers that generate real terror." These moral ambiguities were part of what set the Ghost Army apart from conventional units. They operated in a gray area where success meant convincing not just enemy military leaders, but often civilians as well, that danger existed where it did not. The psychological impact of their deceptions extended beyond purely military considerations. Yet, as the war in Europe approached its final phase, the Ghost Army's operations took on a new urgency. Intelligence suggested that some German commanders, growing desperate as their situation deteriorated, were considering scorched earth tactics or last-stand defenses that would cause massive civilian casualties. Could strategic deception offer alternatives that would save lives on both sides? The answer would come in the Ghost Army's final and perhaps most humane deception, a phantom army group that helped convince a German regional commander that resistance was futile, not through the threat of destruction, but through the illusion of overwhelming force. As the European War entered its final months in 1945, the Ghost Army faced its most consequential challenge. Allied intelligence had identified a German corps commander in the Ruhr region who was preparing a last-stand defense that would likely result in the destruction of dozens of towns and thousands of civilian casualties. Major General William Hafner, commanding the actual U.S. forces in the sector, had insufficient troops to quickly overwhelm these defenses. A protracted battle seemed inevitable, with its attendant cost in lives on both sides.
The Ghost Army was tasked with creating an illusion powerful enough to convince the German commander that resistance was hopeless, thereby saving both American and German lives. This operation isn't about misdirection, Lieutenant Blackwell explained to his sonic deception team. It's about overwhelming presence. We need to create the impression of an irresistible force, not one that will destroy them, but one that makes surrender the only rational choice. The operation that followed represented the culmination of everything the unit had learned about strategic deception. Over 3 nights, they deployed more than 300 inflatable vehicles, created the sonic signature of 30,000 troops, broadcast radio traffic suggesting the presence of 3 divisions, and infiltrated atmosphere actors into villages throughout the region. Most innovatively, they worked with psychological warfare units to plant stories with local civilians about the humane treatment of German soldiers who surrendered to this particular American force. These stories, they hoped, would filter through to the German command, offering an honorable alternative to a suicidal last stand. Sergeant Martin Klein, who had developed many of the unit's atmospheric effects, created what he called surrender signatures, visual and auditory cues designed to suggest that other German units nearby had already capitulated. We broadcast actual German surrender messages we had recorded earlier, mixed with artificial ones, he explained. Then, we created smoke patterns consistent with units destroying documents before surrender. The operation's success exceeded all expectations. Within 48 hours, German reconnaissance reported the presence of overwhelming American forces. Within 72 hours, negotiations for surrender began. A battle that might have lasted weeks and cost thousands of lives was averted entirely. For the men of the Ghost Army, this final major operation represented something profound: the use of deception not to enable violence, but to prevent it. Their shadows and whispers had accomplished what bullets and bombs could not: a bloodless victory. Captain Reeves expressed this sentiment in a letter to his wife. We have spent years creating the illusion of violence, but today we created the illusion of mercy, and it proved more powerful. The weapons of deception can cut both ways. They can magnify terror, but they can also magnify hope. As the war in Europe came to a close in May 1945, the Ghost Army was ordered to prepare for redeployment to the Pacific Theater. The planned deception operations for the invasion of the Japanese home islands would have dwarfed anything they had attempted in Europe. But the Japanese surrender in August meant these plans were never implemented. Instead, the unit began the process of dismantling their elaborate equipment and destroying their operational records. The inflatable tanks were deflated for the last time. The sonic equipment was packed away. The radio deception teams sent their final fake messages. And then, in a final act of deception, the unit itself essentially vanished from military history. Due to the classified nature of their operations, the Ghost Army's existence remained a military secret for decades after the war. The unit was officially disbanded in September 1945, its members sworn to secrecy about their activities. Most returned to civilian life, many resuming the artistic careers they had interrupted to join this most unusual military effort. Lieutenant Thomas Blackwell, our witness to so many phantom battles, became an architectural lighting designer in New York. Captain Harold Reeves returned to Broadway, where his set designs would win Tony Awards in the 1950s. Sergeant Martin Klein pursued chemistry, developing special effects for Hollywood films. Corporal David Silverman pioneered new recording techniques in the early television industry. They carried their secrets with them, unable to fully explain even to family members what they had actually done during the war. When asked about their service, many simply described themselves as having been in camouflage work or special operations. It wasn't until 1996 that the full story of the Ghost Army was declassified, allowing these veterans, those who had lived long enough, to finally receive recognition for their remarkable contribution to the Allied victory. Military historians began to reassess the impact of strategic deception on the outcome of World War II, with some estimating that the Ghost Army's operations may have shortened the European conflict by several months. Perhaps most significantly, the tactical innovations they pioneered fundamentally changed military thinking about deception. Their integration of visual, sonic, radio, and human elements created a multi-sensory approach to battlefield illusion that has influenced military operations ever since. The Ghost Army demonstrated that perception can be as powerful as reality in warfare, that an enemy convinced of a threat will respond to it as though it were real, regardless of its actual existence. This insight transformed deception from a supplementary tactic to a core strategic consideration in military planning. What lessons might we draw from these artists and actors who fought with imagination rather than firepower? Perhaps it's that creativity and innovation can be weapons as powerful as any tank or bomber. Or that understanding human psychology, how people perceive, interpret, and react, can sometimes accomplish what direct force cannot. Maybe it's simply that in war, as in art, what we don't see can influence us as profoundly as what we do see. That the spaces between things, the shadows and suggestions, shape our understanding of reality just as much as concrete facts. As we look back on these phantom armies that never existed yet changed the course of history, we might wonder, how many other hidden forces shape our world today? Invisible currents guiding events in ways we never notice. The Ghost Army reminds us that sometimes the most powerful influences are the ones operating just beyond the edge of our perception, like decoys on distant cliffs or signals in the night.